to King Fahd of Saudi Arabia and all our allies and friends that have rallied behind us in this cause.
Well,
and we are deeply grateful to all those who are in Desert Storm, and we pray and we hope that we can see the conclusion of this operation with the minimum loss of life.
Good.
But
Now,
in response to your question, we do not really have a definite confirmation on how this military operation is going. It's massive, it's wide in its aspect, and we have to wait and see when we get the military reports on it.
Whether or not Saddam Hussein survives this war, the Middle East will still be a dangerous and unstable place. Before this war, Kuwait, like a number of other nations now aligned with the United States, was resistance to having an American presence on the ground in the Middle East. Knowing what you now know, would you, in Kuwait now, welcome an American presence continuing on the ground in Kuwait after this war?
George, our foreign policy has always been in the past, as well as our allies and friends in the region, is to keep the Gulf free from any foreign presence, because we didn't want to see an escalation by different nations by inviting different forces. We wanted to be an area of peace and stability. But obviously, Saddam Hussein has now created a new kind of political era for the region. And we would like to see a secure and a stable region for the future. What that will entail with regard to having a new security arrangement for the region is yet to be decided. And we are in intensive discussion with our allies in the Arab world, in the Gulf, and with our friends around the world, including the United States.
But you're not in principle opposed to an American presence?
I don't think now we are in a position to pronounce on this subject. As I said, we are in intensive discussion with regard to the this issue. And let's face it, it has repeatedly been said that the U.S. has been in the Gulf for over 40 years now. It's not something, a new phenomena. And we have been a close friend and ally of the United States for so many years. And let's wait and see how this whole new world order is going to evolve with regard to security arrangements for the region.
One of the things that U.S. policymakers have been saying in terms of the new order is that the United States needs to be pushing for democracy in the area, because the United States needs to be seen as the true champion of the Arab peoples. How willing would you be to see a democracy?
Well, this has always been a misconception on the part of many of our friends around the world. Kuwait was and has been always driving for a democratic, full democratic life inside the country. And we had a democracy in Kuwait, relative democracy, take into consideration the political situation in the area. We had a certain turbulence, or political turbulence in Kuwait and in the region, and there has been some kind of a stall in attaining the main objective that we had in attaining full democracy.
But there have been recent statements by the royal family that there would not be a move towards reassembling the National Assembly or to going to elections.
No, I believe the contrary. The statements that came out from the government is that we made a commitment that the Constitution of 1962 will be fully implemented once stability and security in Kuwait has been achieved. Now, there is a period here where, until we can achieve that security in the area, where some new arrangements have to be worked out, because the country has been under occupation for 7 months now. The people have suffered, the country in ruin, and we have to work out a system whereby I think priorities have to be here addressed. It's not moving in and establishing full democracy now, notwithstanding the havoc that the country is under. So there is a period of pause here until we can achieve that stage where the 1962 Constitution will be fully implemented.
Mr. Ambassador, I'm sorry, but we're pressed for time. I do thank you for coming. Pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Coming next, our Secretary of State, James A. Baker. Meet him up.
Partners that the Iraqi forces would not fight. I think it's premature to jump to that conclusion. To some extent, some of the best forces have not as yet been engaged. But so far, at least, it would appear that things are going very, very well, and we're very grateful for that, of course.
Before the ground war started, General Schwarzkopf said that the Iraqi army was on the verge of collapse. We were destroying 100 tanks a day or more from the air. and that about 40%, upwards of 40%, had been destroyed, which raised the question on some people's minds, why didn't we just proceed with the air war for 10 more days, 1,000 more tanks? Was the decision to go ahead with the ground war in some way conditioned by the Soviet initiative and the feeling that the peace process was getting out of control?
No, not really. I think, as you've heard earlier today, the planning date for the ground war was set some time ago, for yesterday evening Washington time at 8 p.m. Of course, the president could have said no up till the point of kicking it off. So it was not really a case of that initiative advancing things. But we had a situation here where Iraq was adopting a scorched earth policy in Kuwait. It was rounding up and executing Kuwaiti citizens, holding some of them hostages as human shields. There was no indication on the part of the government of Iraq that they, after 6.5 months, they were ready for an unconditional and immediate withdrawal. So the president concluded, I think rightly so, that it was time to move.
You've just referred to something that, by almost any definition, is a war crime, what they've been doing now to the civilians, let alone the crime of waging aggressive war. If our forces do indeed sweep north of Kuwait and cut off that force there and it surrenders, technically the UN mandate will have been fulfilled. That is, they will have been ejected from Kuwait.
Right.
But this war all along has had a didactic dimension to it, to teach lessons about the New World Order. In order to teach that lesson, do you need to have something like discipline of Kuwait and war crimes trials?
I think it's important to note that the 12 UN resolutions, George, provide for a couple of things. First, war aims, 2 war aims specifically: unconditional immediate withdrawal from Kuwait, restoration of the legitimate government of Kuwait. Those are still the war aims of the coalition. But there are many political aims that are set forth in those resolutions, and that's why we found the Soviet plan, for instance, totally unacceptable, because it called for the nullification of the other 11 resolutions, and they contain political aims, one of which is restoration of peace and stability in the Gulf, and you're not going to have that unless you send a signal such as you've suggested.
Cumulatively and practically, do those other 11 imply that he has to go, Saddam Hussein?
They imply that the restoration of peace and stability in the Gulf would be a heck of a lot easier if he and his and that leadership were not in power in Iraq. We don't know yet exactly how the war is going to terminate. If they remain in power, there will be some things that we will want to continue to insist upon, as we've said before, such as an international arms embargo, perhaps, against the rebuilding of this very disproportionate military power and against trying to recreate the weapons of mass destruction that we have succeeded in degrading and destroying.
Let's say he is gone, and now we're talking about peace and stability in the region. The promises, or something short of promises perhaps, that have been made to the allies fighting with the United States, are these likely to be contradictory? Do people expect different things to come out of this war? Does Israel have a different expectation of what the region's going to be like than Egypt does, than Syria does?
Oh, I don't think we have. We're a long ways, I think, from resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict. But that is one of the things, I think, that we will have, one of the issues that we will have to address in attempting to secure the peace. And I think that it might be, while winning the war is our first priority, it is apparently beginning to go in the direction that we want it to go. And I don't think we ought to underestimate the difficulty that will be involved in securing the peace in the aftermath of winning the war. There will be different viewpoints with respect to what sort of regional security arrangements there should be, with respect to how the Arab-Israeli conflict should be solved, with respect to whether there should be arms control and proliferation regimes, with respect to questions of economic reconstruction.
And one of the countries with whom there will be different viewpoints is the Soviet Union. One of the reasons the region has been unstable has been the role that the Soviet Union has played in the past.
That is correct.
Is one of the concerns you have here, when you look at the movement over the last several days, that the Soviet Union is trying to play a role that will not lead to stability in the region, play the role as peacemaker, portraying the United States as warmonger?
No, I don't see the Soviet Union as wanting to play a role contributing to instability in the region. I don't think we should accept that naively, but that does not happen to be my interpretation or impression based on extensive contacts, and particularly over the past week between President Gorbachev, President Bush, myself, and the foreign minister. I don't think that's what this peace initiative is all about. I do think they feel it is important that they play a role, continue to play a role. You've heard the president characterize their efforts as very useful and efforts that we appreciate.
Do you agree that they should play a role?
But yes. I think that they can contribute if the role that they play is positive, and they can contribute significantly to the resolution of some of these problems that pre-existed this crisis. And they were, after all, playing a negative role before. Ever since the 3rd of August, when they stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States, at least with respect to the Gulf crisis, they have played a positive role. And it has been important to have the Soviet Union supporting these UN resolutions, or we might not have been able to do what we have done.
The UN resolution calling for peace and stability in the Middle East, won't that require us to go on beyond Kuwait?
It would permit us to do so. If you mean go on militarily?
Yes.
It's a political goal, David. It would...
very often they're achieved militarily.
Well, that's right, but we have not adopted that. We have not adopted the military goal of proceeding beyond the two objectives I've just mentioned, that is, immediate and unconditional withdrawal by Iraq from Kuwait and restoration of a legitimate government.
Two quick questions. Did the blast of war on the ground blow off the table the American proposal for ending this? In other words, could Saddam Hussein still sue for peace under the American plan as of
we would not withdraw the proposal. We're not yanking the proposal off the table because it meets the terms fully of the United Nations resolutions, but we would want to test any Iraqi acceptance of that, make sure that it is genuine. We remember, after all, the Battle of Khafji, when they sent their tanks into that small Saudi Arabian town with the turrets turned backwards, which is the traditional method of surrendering tanks, got into position, turned the turrets around very quickly, and started firing.
A premise
of American foreign policy in the 80s was that democracies make for peace. 21 Arab nations, no democracy yet. A, do you think Kuwait owes it to the United States after our exertions to have a democracy promptly? And B, the Hitler analogy has been played hard with respect to Iraq. After the Second World War, we denazified Germany, helped them write a constitution. Is that implied in the Hitler analogy? Deal with Kuwait first. To de-Saddam Husseinize
Iraq?
Iraq.
Well, that, again, a political aim, but not an aim that, if you're talking about the occupation of all of Iraq and that sort of thing, it's quite different than what happened at the end of World War II. With respect to what kind of government there should be in any of our coalition partners, we support democracy. We know that democracy is the best system, but we should not say that that is a requirement for our resisting unprovoked aggression. We should not adopt a policy of saying that the government of Kuwait has to change, or what we're really doing is permitting aggression to affect political change, and that would be, I think, a terrible mistake.
Mr. Secretary, thank you.
Thank you
very much. Pleased to have you with us. Come again. Coming next, our discussion here with our own ruminations, conjectures, and querulous thoughts. And joining us will be Tom Wicker, a columnist for the New York Times. And I just take it for granted we'll win it rather soon. What happens then? Are we going to leave Saddam Hussein in office, president's office, or whatever he chooses to call it, with all of his weapons, all of his attitudes? What are we going to do? George, what do you think?
This war, David, started north to south. It started on the 16th of January in Baghdad and moved south, taking out strategic targets first. The danger was that he might stay in power, and we wanted him as disarmed as possible. As the evidence of war crimes mounts, the idea of the United States participating, say, in the rebuilding of Iraq is inconceivable with that man in there. So the promise of American aid will be leveraged to encourage anyone, if he's still standing, someone in Iraq to make sure he's not still
The
standing.
American people want him gone. The latest poll out today...
right, as usual.
Right. 71% say that we should go on and get him out of there. And I think that it's a sense that if we've gone this far, why on earth be in a position to maybe have to come back and do it again in a year or 2 years? Get it over with.
Tom, what do you think?
Well, if that implies a further military drive on in to conquer and occupy Iraq, I think that would be a mistake. In the first place, your question was if he were left with all his weapons. Well, if we complete the encircling movements that we've been shown this morning about Kuwait, he's not going to be left with all his weapons.
No, but he'll be able to buy more when the time.
Well, not necessarily. Not necessarily. That was the point that I was going to make, that there are political arrangements that can be made and that should be made that would prevent that. Whereas if we take the military road of moving on to Baghdad and overthrowing that regime by force and occupying it, it seems to me we open up not just one, but any number of cans of worms that we don't need. It's not necessary. Saddam Hussein is going to suffer, if what we've been told is true, and I believe it is, he's going to suffer a horrendous defeat. And he's going to lose the great majority of his weapons. He's lost his infrastructure through the bombing of that country. He's going to be broke. It's going to take a terrific job to rebuild Iraq, even to 10% of what it was before this war started.
Sam Donaldson in Saudi Arabia, do you care to join this little discussion here? Put in your nickel's worth or something?
Well, of course, I would always care to join, David. There's no military plan to go on Baghdad, root out every cellar, look in every mosque for Saddam Hussein. But the belief is here he's through. Tom is right. We're going to destroy most of his army. Now, if he were to sue for peace tonight, if he were to cry uncle, as Ronald Reagan once said, well, yes, we would stop the fighting from the standpoint of killing his soldiers, but we would destroy every tank, every artillery piece, every one of his weapons that the Republican Guards has. He would be a loser. And the thought is that his own people, what's left of his own military, would somehow get rid of him, because he would just be a man who had lost and been humiliated in every possible way. And you talk about saving face in the Arab world, he'd have no face left.
Sam, thank you. Koki, right.
I wonder if he does stay a loser, though. I mean, that has not been the history of Arabs who lose wars, that they come back and fight another day. And the whole question of 28 countries aligned against him and the whole superpower structure against him, if he's still alive and he's still in power in any shape or form, I think that he can turn it around in some way that can be to his advantage.
As best I can recall at the moment, I don't believe there's a country in the world with a leader as dominant and as powerfully dominant as he is in Iraq. So who would replace him? Who would dare step forward and challenge him?
The person who does would get killed.
Well, they came awfully close to killing Hitler. I mean, it was a fluke that they didn't blow him up with a bomb on the 20th of July, 1940. It can be done, but the Ba'ath Party that furnished forth Saddam Hussein might just produce an endless stream of thugs, perhaps not of his lurid dimensions, but still bad enough. So there is something to be said for us trying to sow the seeds of democracy somewhere in the Arab world.
Well, they don't generally grow very well when planted, do they?
Well, it depends on who plants them. We did rather well in Japan and Germany.
I mean, in the Middle East. Good. Tom, what?
I just think that the question of Saddam Hussein personally is not fundamentally the question here, because I disagree with Koki, if you don't mind my saying so.
No, I don't. I don't think
the history of Arab leaders, for instance, Nasser, is that they do come back after they've suffered a defeat to the extent that they were there before. And I think the real fact here is that Iraq, the country, the infrastructure, the economy, the army, is taking a terrific pounding. It's taken a terrific pounding, and it's taken even more in the next few days. And so it seems to me that the question whether or not Saddam Hussein remains in power...
Tom, we're out of time, and we can't settle this today. Let's come back to it another time. We'll be back in a moment. We'll have a CBC News. This is a Gulf War update.
I'm Bob Jameson in New York. While the news from the first day of the ground war has been good, a few minutes ago, the Saudi capital of Riyadh came under a Scud missile attack. One Patriot missile launched, and a second Patriot intercepted the Scud. The Allied commander in the Gulf, General Norman Schwarzkopf, said coalition forces achieved all of their first-day objectives on the ground, encountering what was described as light resistance and suffering only light casualties. Allied troops reportedly captured thousands of Iraqi prisoners. There are unconfirmed reports that some Allied forces have advanced to the outskirts of Kuwait City. ABC News will present a special report on the Gulf War with Ted Koppel beginning at 6:30 Eastern Time. This has been a Gulf War update.
In Iraq and Kuwait on all sides. On the ground, Allied forces are moving quickly across the desert, but there is little precise information on the targets of their attack and little reported Iraqi opposition. And from the Persian Gulf, the battleship Missouri, a relic of the Second World War, is bombarding the Kuwaiti coastline. She began her firing shortly after yesterday's deadline expired, hitting anti-aircraft batteries and enemy bunkers. But at dawn, with smoke from fires on the Kuwaiti coast on the scene, the battleship turns its guns now on Kuwait City, setting up the land offensive that everyone expects to continue unabated. In fact, there are reports as well of Allied forces now on the outskirts of Kuwait City. That would be an extraordinary amount of ground that has been gained in the first 18 hours or so of this operation. NBC's Fred Francis is standing by now at the Pentagon. And Fred, since there is more information available to us, that's one more indication that things are going very well.
So well, Tom. It's well ahead of schedule. One senior Pentagon official said it's almost too good to be true. The president has been told to expect only 3 or 4 days of combat. That may be revised if this thing keeps going as fast as it's going. U.S. forces are about 40 miles into Kuwait along the coast, and U.S. forces are well over 60 miles into Iraq in the western desert. And again, they're going for that big encircling move. And like I say, Tom, they say there are few pitched battles and fewer than a dozen U.S. casualties so far. Tom?
Thank you, Fred Francis of the Pentagon. And Bob Costas, I just want to remind you, I'll be here in Saudi Arabia, and we'll have our people dispatched throughout the entire Persian Gulf to bring you up to date on this NBC station on America at War, now in a land offensive that appears to be going very well. Now back to you, Bob.
Tom, thanks very much. And as you said, we'll be checking back with you throughout the day.
This is an ABC News special report on the Gulf War.
This is an ABC News update on the Gulf War. I'm David Brinkley in Washington, and before we go any further, I want to pass along a report we just this minute got from the Pentagon, and it is that American casualties in the Gulf War so far are less than 20. Less than 20. Now, we have the first video coming in from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, I think, though we can't tell you exactly where this is. First pictures of the American forces moving northward, mostly in trucks, tanks, and so on, in northern Saudi Arabia and somewhere around the border of Kuwait. Sam Donaldson in Saudi Arabia is watching all of this with me, as is Tony Cordesman, our military analyst, who has been helping us out since this began. Sam, tell us what you've got there.
Well, David, we believe we have the first video of U.S. Marines in combat. They are in Kuwait, and you're exactly right. We can't tell you precisely where they are, but they are some distance from the border. Let's take a look at what we see. Now, this video is from a pool that ABC's Linda Patillo is on with the Marines. You see their armor as the Marines move forward. This is the battalion's strength, but there are other battalions ahead of her. Now, you're just about to see a Marine mine-laying charge. That was called a MICLIC. It's a charge to blow up a minefield. And in a moment, those we believe are Iraqi prisoners that are surrendering to the Marines. Listen to the small arms fire. I think you can hear it. The cameraman is at some distance.
We can hear it.
That's right. We think those are Iraqis who are attempting to surrender. And in the distance, you can hear the battle of small arms fire. Marine Air is supporting this operation. That was the first video that we just cut very hastily here. It's still coming in on our monitors from the pool tape that Linda sent in just a few minutes ago.
Tony Cordesman, are you watching this along with us? You are, aren't you?
I am indeed, David.
Now, these, I believe, are 3 or maybe 4 Marine support battalions moving toward the front. Now, exactly what would their mission be here in these pictures we see? What would you think?
David, we don't know exactly where they are, but we have a pretty good idea of what they have to be doing. If we look at Kuwait, my guess is that they will be somewhere in this region here. As for what they're doing, we need to go in close and take a look at their forward defense positions. Now, somewhere out here were probably the first berm that these people breached. In this area,
can we go back to the previous satellite shot, because I think we'll understand better.
That's it.
If we look in this area here, there are certainly going to be minefields throughout it. Now, what we're watching when we see these lines were those deep trenches. A few days ago, we saw those being burned with napalm to ensure that they couldn't be used with oil. And these lines we see here are forward reinforcing lines to get to positions scattered throughout there. That unit is advancing along very narrow lines to get through the minefields, clearing the minefields as it goes. It has bulldozers and other equipment to fill these breaches in. And it is beginning to close in, and we can just see these little triangular shapes we call lapidas, dating back to the days when the Greeks used a similar defensive technique
What are they
thousands
called,
of years
Tony?
ago.
Say that again. What are they called?
Pitas, P-I-T-A-S, just like the bread we've gotten
bread,
familiar
huh?
with.
Yeah.
Now, what we're also finding behind here, there are artillery units coming in. We've heard occasional fire coming in, but combat engineering is one of the most dangerous and difficult jobs in battle because they have to go in with very exposed equipment and get through all of these defenses. And let's just take a look at one more picture of what that can be like. It is a graphic rather than a satellite photo, but it may bring home the problems being faced. Razor wire, mines, both anti-personnel and anti-tank, always the risk it could be chemical. Low berms, they may not look like much, but when you cross them, you become exposed to anti-tank fire. Somewhere, the anti-tank barriers, behind those high berms with dug-in tanks and anti-tank weapons.
Tony, the men who have to do that work are among the toughest and the bravest in all of the armed services, right?
That's absolutely right, particularly when you have to go forward. All you have to do is see their equipment. They're not behind inches or feet of armor. They have no real weapons. Often they have to get out on foot, regardless of the fire, risk their lives, sometimes sacrifice them if they're coming under fire to breach through these barriers.
They cut holes through what they call berms, which are merely piles of sand or earth or dirt. What they say is, we cut a hole and then the Army rolls through it. Dangerous work. Sam, what's happening there? Anything further to tell us?
Well, I think we have some video we're about to show you that shows more of the Iraqi surrendering. I don't see it on my monitor.
I don't see it either, but
have it up in just a moment.
We're sort of making this up as we go along.
Well, we're making it up because the arrangement, as you know, David, is that the pool material comes into the headquarters here and it's distributed to all of the networks, and we are just getting it as are other news organizations.
Are those prisoners of war? There must be. They have their arms up behind their heads. Those are POWs. Can you see them?
Well, I don't see it. No, they haven't put it in my monitor out here.
Well, as I say, this is somewhat casual.
Now I see it.
See him?
There's a howitzer being
POWs,
in a long line of POWs
lying on the ground.
Streaming back from the front.
Lying on the ground. Others coming in.
Yes, others streaming back to the front.
Tony, what can you make out of this?
What you're saying is nearly, at this point, a battalion element.
Well, you know, all of the reports, excuse me, Tony, all of the reports that we've had so far, and they have admittedly been sketchy, are that so far these Iraqi soldiers that are being met are giving up. We saw a Saudi unit that we put on the air a little while ago, white flags everywhere, and now we see long lines of Iraqi POWs coming back. I assume that we've got to continue to caution everyone that these are not the elite Republican Guards. These are not Iraq's best troops. But surely these are not just the few that they had in front of the minefields.
No, this is definitely, looking at it, Sam, there are too many for it to be anything other than a battalion-sized formation. When you get that many people surrendering that quickly, you have achieved a significant amount of demoralization in the enemy. And you'll notice they're all walking, they're all moving their arms, there's no sign of combat wounds.
Now, Tony, you know what we had heard from the defectors who had come across the border in the last couple of weeks were that there was no food, there was one meal a day, if that, the pounding for the B-52s were incessant, and that the demoralization was very, very large spread. And this would seem to substantiate that.
Okay. Tony, anything to add before we wind this up?
No, it's a good beginning. I think we just have to be careful because we are still hours away from getting to their main defensive positions.
Well, we'll be here to report it whenever it happens and whenever it becomes available to us. Tony and Sam, thank you very much. ABC News will continue covering the war. We will bring you news, whatever it is, whenever we...
Radio, so I think for many of them, they're making up their own minds about which claims of this battle to start believing. Baghdad Radio has been telling them that the Iraqi forces are holding firm and repelling invading forces. And, of course, foreign broadcasts, which they can pick up on shortwave here, are telling them that the Allies are sweeping through southern Iraq and Kuwait.
What is it like in Baghdad today on the streets?
Strangely enough, Jane, there's a sense of calm rather than fear. As I said, a sense of relief that the battle has started, and more a feeling of concern for those Iraqi troops at the front line. I guess like any mother of any soldier all over the world, up here in Baghdad, people are worried about their sons, their brothers, their husbands on the front line, and they're staying close by radios for any news of the battle, who's winning it, which way the forces are flowing, and the final outcome of it, of course, we won't know, at least up here, until either win or lose, the Iraqi army lets us know.
Well, Tom, thank you. Tom Aspell in Baghdad. NBC's Garrick Utley joins me now with a closer look at a man we know to be ambitious and ruthless, but there's much we don't know about Saddam Hussein.
Especially this evening, Jane. We can only imagine what is happening in the mind and to the psyche of Saddam Hussein as his army and his power crumble all around him. But one important clue is that he may not always be the all-confident leader that we see in public.
Look at him closely, the body language. Listen to him, the silence. Saddam Hussein last month on the eve of the war visiting his troops. Little small talk, a man clearly worried, remote. It was a revealing moment of truth as Saddam Hussein awaited the war he had brought upon himself. This is how Saddam Hussein wanted us to see him, and perhaps how he saw himself. A chorus of adulation wherever he went, shouting, "Saddam is great." But one-on-one, he was never a leader with a common touch. Nor is he a man of his faith. The man who called for a holy war is a devout secularist who executed Islamic fundamentalist leaders in his country. How could we have anticipated what this man would do? Perhaps if we had read a book he published back in 1977. It was published only in Arabic and German. Its title, Unser Kampf, Our Struggle and International Politics. A thin book, but just like Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, filled with the ambitions and plans of a future dictator. Journalist Elizabeth Kieterlin found the little-known book and wrote about it in her German newspaper, The Parallels with Hitler.
Both said they are going to have war, they want war. Both said they want to destruct Jews.
In the book, Saddam Hussein wrote that Jews should be driven out of Israel, that oil should be used as a means to divide the West, that the Arab world could be united only in times of tension, that therefore war is necessary. Not idle words. Saddam Hussein took them from the printed page into our world. The Scuds falling on Israel. The oil in Kuwait he tried to seize, and when he faced losing it, has tried to destroy. The use of war to achieve his goals.
Are you ready for your enemy?
The Americans are not enemies. They're animals.
Is that the mind, the dreams of a madman?
I don't think he's crazy at all. He's, in his analysis, he's very rational and very cunning, very clever. It's a brutal philosophy in the means and in the goals, but it's not, he's not crazy at all.
Perhaps not. Perhaps he saw a method in what we see as his madness. But what does Saddam Hussein do now as he sees his army, his war, his dreams collapsing? Arab specialists say that his personal code of honor will not allow him to give in or give up. Saddam Hussein himself has said that he would die violently one day, that there would not be the tip of his little finger to find. There was not even that much of Adolf Hitler remaining when he died in his bunker in Berlin. And now Saddam Hussein waits in his bunker in Baghdad. Early in this conflict, President Bush drew some criticism when he compared Saddam Hussein to Adolf Hitler. There are important differences, to be sure, but also a common lesson. Would-be dictators often spell out exactly what they intend to do.
We only have to read their books. Jane?
Thank you, Garrick. And now Tom Brokaw joins us again from Saudi Arabia. Tom.
Thank you, Jane. The White House tonight is echoing other assessments of this war, saying that the whole operation so far has been very successful. And if it continues on this course, President Bush then will have a very fat political...
Deeper into Iraq and Kuwait, Marines have now reached the outskirts of Kuwait City and predict its liberation will come soon. Allied casualties are reported at 11 killed, that number called surprisingly small by military commanders, and Iraqi forces, as you see, in Kuwait, surrendering so quickly and in such large numbers that Pentagon sources say handling them is turning out to be their biggest problem so far. Good evening, everyone. President Bush met with his National Security Council tonight and heard glowing reports on the ground war now in its second day.
And Charles Ziwi is in Saudi Arabia tonight with the latest on what we know about the ground offensive. Charles, what do you have?
Catherine and Tom, the offensive continues at this hour. In fact, Desert Storm Commander General Norman Schwarzkopf is urging his commanders to get on with it, to speed up the invasion process and to go toward Kuwait City, where, as you've reported, paratroopers are already encircling the city. Now, at 11 dead, those casualty figures are considered extremely light. It began with combat engineers penetrating Iraq's outer defenses, opening paths for armored columns that streamed in to hammer enemy artillery and force Baghdad's soldiers out into the open. Striking along a 300-mile-long front, the dreaded Saddam line was breached by thousands of troops from 11 nations, moving in flanking maneuvers. There was little resistance.
Actually, it was a little easier than I thought it would be. You know, I'd heard a lot of optimistic reports, but I'm not exactly an optimist at times, so I was real pleased with how it went.
Allied casualties were described as remarkably light. Among the wounded, victims of shrapnel from exploding mines and bullet wounds.
I thought I was dead.
Really?
Yeah, but because you know, it's like a hit right in the head right here. But a couple seconds after that, you know, I could hear voices and I was good to go.
More than 5,500 Iraqi prisoners have been taken. Long lines of enemy prisoners that snake through the desert toward captivity are now posing a logistics problem for the Allies.
We want the free quit, all quit.
The long-expected ground assault came just 8 hours after the deadline set by the Desert Storm allies for Iraq to pull out of Kuwait expired. Pilots who screamed in low to support ground troops had to fly through plumes of black smoke for more than 200 oil fires.
It looks like what I envisioned hell would look like. I hope I never have the opportunity to see firsthand, but the country of Kuwait is burning.
Yeah, I got second-degree burns on the wrist and on the elbow.
At forward emergency hospitals throughout the battle zone tonight, casualties are trickling in. There are burns, fractures, and bullet wounds, but not in the large numbers predicted by some analysts before the ground war began. And something else, Catherine and Tom, that was not predicted is how quickly all of this has gone. Some people before the ground war began were predicting it might take weeks or perhaps even a couple of months to accomplish what they've accomplished in less than 24 hours. And now some of those same analysts are saying it may be a matter of days before the ground war can be concluded. Back to you.
Charles, you mentioned the fact that there are so many Iraqi prisoners. There are some problems in handling them. Any idea on what they are doing with them?
Well, they're doing several things where they're choppering them to the POW camps. They are set up there to take care of 100,000. So there'll be a hindrance, but they are already were thinking in those large numbers before the war began. I don't think they expected them to get them quite this quickly, though.
Thank you, Charles.
Charles Ziwi reporting from Saudi Arabia tonight. To this point, we have neither seen nor heard anything from that huge coalition force that has moved up into Iraq to take on Republican Guard units. But reporters traveling with the 2nd Marine Division toward Kuwait City have found a common theme among those troops. They are surprised at how easy it's been. So far, it's been easy in the sand south of Kuwait City.
Right now, I feel sorry for the people that are remaining on the enemy side because we're going to wipe them out. It's just a matter of time.
All around them, they see the weapons left behind by surrendering Iraqi troops or destroyed by coalition shelling. They have felt very little return fire from an enemy that, to this point, seems overrated.
Of course, I've never been to combat before, but I thought it'd be a lot tougher. But then again, it's not over yet either, so I don't know. It's just not as tough as I thought.
I think we beat them up pretty bad with the air war. I think they're probably pretty demoralized right now, but I don't want to underestimate them.
That reality always seems to be just below the surface. The mine that blew the axle off a Marine armored vehicle was a reminder of that, and maybe that reminder wasn't necessary.
Well, certainly there's still a formidable army out there that the Iraqis have put into Kuwait, and we've still yet to meet all of our objectives for future operations, and only the next few days will tell.
There are some reports, as Charles Ziwi mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, that helicopters are running missions over Kuwait City, leading to speculation, and only speculation to this point, that airborne troops are being dropped into that area.
A Kuwaiti family is watching this war from their new home in the Bay Area.
Telephoned the Situation Room and learned the early hours of the Allied ground invasion had been remarkably successful. Then Mr. Bush, his family, and several members of the cabinet went to Sunday morning church services together to pray, the White House said, for a speedy end to the war.
The fact that we've captured thousands of Iraqis in the first few hours of the operation is evidence of the success of the air campaign, that they have been cut off from their supplies, that they are badly demoralized, and that they'd rather quit than fight, and that's obviously a great advantage for us.
The battle to retake Kuwait, Cheney said, will not be a long, drawn-out campaign. In fact, here on Capitol Hill, a number of lawmakers were told by senior Pentagon officials that the heaviest fighting of this offensive could be wrapped up within 3 to 5 days. After that, it would be a mop-up operation, they were told. Hopes of a stunningly short land war with low casualties spread through the capital like wildfire, prompting the president's men to rush around town, dampening hopes, reminding reporters Saddam may still have some fight left in him.
He still does have a very formidable army, and I think we need to be cautious about euphoria.
The test, Pentagon sources say, will be when the Allies fully engage Saddam's highly trained Republican Guard, and that hasn't happened yet. In Washington, Tina Galland, News Center.
It will be a very short war and a very complete victory. Operation Desert Storm tonight, rolling through and sealing off Iraqi positions in Kuwait and in Iraq. Almost no opposition. The biggest problem in the early hours, the thousands of Iraqis who have surrendered. There was so little resistance from most units, they made better time racing across the desert than most American commuters during rush hour. This is the 2nd Marine Division, and it rounded up hundreds of Iraqi prisoners as it headed north. NBC's Rick Davis was with the 101st Airborne when it invaded Iraq.
2,000 members of the 101st Airborne landed by helicopter 70 miles inside Iraq. They carried with them a wide arsenal of weapons, including vehicles mounted with TOW missiles. Another 2,000 members of the 101st Airborne and a massive array of weapons are on their way by road, punching their way north. They are, at this point, behind the Revolutionary Guard. They are doing so well that they're running into very little opposition, and those they are meeting are surrendering.
The 18th Army Artillery invaded Iraq as well, sending round after round into enemy positions. Young American gunners were eager to complete the battle.
We had to go kill people, but that's the only way we're getting home. I see it's either them or me.
The big guns of the USS Missouri, a holdover from World War II, were hard at work from the sea, concentrating on the Kuwaiti coastline. The third leg of the air-land-sea battle plan. F-16 attack planes, which flew close air support for the troops on the ground. One Marine plane was reported lost today. Saddam Hussein did try another Scud attack on the Saudi capital of Riyadh, and again, the Patriots successfully intercepted. Along the road to Kuwait City, it looks as if the battle has been going on for days, not hours. The destruction is so complete. American military commanders caution the toughest fighting is yet to come. But tonight, they're well ahead of schedule and keeping the pressure on Saddam Hussein.
I would hope that the son of a gun would wake up and smell the coffee, frankly, but we'll just have to wait and see.
We want to remind you that official details are tightly held by the military. We do not yet have a complete list of American casualties, for example, but based on what we know, based on the early going, if it continues in this fashion, and there is no guarantee that it will, but if it does continue in this fashion, it will be a triumph of historic proportions for President Bush and for the American military. NBC's John Cochran is at the White House tonight, and Fred Francis is at the Pentagon. Fred, Iraq promised the mother of all battles, and now it appears that it's about to become an orphan. Let's go to John Cochran and find out what the president is thinking about all of this tonight. John?
Tom, the president has just received a briefing, a military briefing, after which he was described as very gratified by the initial successes. But he was also obviously concerned that American casualties are starting to increase.
Having urged other Americans to pray for Allied forces, Mr. Bush did the same at the Episcopal church known as the Church of Presidents, St. John's, just a block from the White House. During the service, the President and Mrs. Bush could hear anti-war protesters pounding drums. As the Bushes left, police moved in to arrest a demonstrator, one of several arrested near the White House. But the President knows overall support for the war is strong. What happens after the war is uncertain. Who, for example, protects Kuwait after the Iraqis are expelled? On Meet the Press, Bush's national security advisor said, "This is one job that can be done without Americans."
Certainly, we must have a force around the borders of Kuwait in order to preserve the security of that state. But that might very well be able to be done by Arab forces.
Today, the Soviets criticized Bush for turning down Moscow's request to delay the attack a day or two. U.S. officials say new reports of atrocities by Iraq forced Bush to move.
It was rounding up and executing Kuwaiti citizens, holding some of them hostages as human shields.
And the big question, what does the future hold for Saddam Hussein?
Assuming that he suffers a crushing defeat, does this lower the chances that Saddam can survive politically?
Hopefully.
More than hopefully?
I think the result will be an Iraq with seriously diminished military capability, but still with some defensive capability.
U.S. officials tell NBC News they would not be surprised if the Emir of Kuwait is back in his homeland tomorrow, Kuwait's National Day, the Kuwaiti equivalent of July 4th. Tom?
Thank you, John Cochran at the White House, the residence of the Commander-in-Chief. Now let's go across the Potomac to the Pentagon and NBC's Fred Francis, who has the military equation for us tonight. And Fred, what did happen to the Iraqis?
Well, Tom, the first battle reports received here in Washington made it seem as if the Iraqi army was observing a curfew. Few of the Iraqis came out to fight, and most of those who did surrendered quickly. The Allied assault, a long-planned combination of deep strikes with high speed and heavy firepower, was going so well by this morning that the President was told by Defense Secretary Cheney and General Colin Powell to expect only 3 or 4 days of heavy fighting.
The resistance has been light all across the front. The breaching operations have been successful. The casualties, fortunately, have been extremely light, as Norm said. One of the big problems we've been faced with are just dealing with all of the prisoners that are coming south.
Other officials said there were fewer than a dozen American casualties in the first 12 hours. But NBC News has been told those figures are now much higher. The first American, British, and French tanks crossed into Iraq early yesterday afternoon. They were 40 miles into Iraq without significant opposition and, said one senior official, would roll 100 miles deep into southern Iraq before turning south to control a large slice of Iraq and confront Saddam's battered Republican guards.
We have no interest in occupying Iraq, but we've also said that there won't be any sanctuary inside Iraq for those forces that have been involved in occupying Kuwait.
With the largest armored columns in the north, American and Allied forces in the south are in the process of splitting much of occupied Kuwait into battle zones to encircle Saddam's forces in several areas and block them with thousands of troops flown into southern Iraq by helicopter. The overall goal is to form a buffer zone on Kuwait's northern flank, from Basra to the Saudi border, to prevent a retreat. Well, Tom, that is the military goal. The political goal is to destroy or capture the army which keeps Saddam in power, to be able to craft the terms of the peace in the wake of Iraq's defeat. Tom?
Thank you, Fred Francis at the Pentagon. Baghdad Radio tonight broadcast a speech from Saddam Hussein, what's left of his troops in the field, and he said, fight them in the style of the faithful men. They are the camp of atheism, hypocrisy, and treachery. And Iraq then went on to claim that it, in fact, is winning the war. When Nightly News continues in a moment, Gary Utley in New York, and NBC's
holding and inflicting heavy casualties on the Allied forces. A second communique read out over the radio just after dark here denied Allied reports that U.S. Marines had captured the island of Faylaka off the Kuwaiti coast and challenged the Americans to provide proof of their battle claims. Here in Baghdad, Iraqis are paying close attention to news of the battle on their radios. There's hardly a family in the capital which doesn't have a man at the front. They feel their country's future now hangs in the balance. Tom Aspel, NBC News, Baghdad.
The Gulf crisis and now the war itself have divided the Arab world. Egypt and Syria side with the United States and its allies and have committed their troops. On the other side, Arabs who chose to side with Saddam Hussein. For them, tonight is a time for a painful reappraisal, or perhaps just for frustration and anger. An example, Jordan. Dennis Murphy is in Amman tonight. Dennis?
Garrick, it's very near time now to sort out winners and losers in the Arab world. Jordan seems dazed by it all. Most people here realize Saddam is being crushed, and they're in the loser's corner. 50 women chanted outside the U.S. Embassy here today. American citizens were advised to stay at home and exercise extreme caution. The Arabic newspapers condemned the United States for brushing off the last-minute Iraqi offer to withdraw from Kuwait. George Bush is a hated man on some streets here.
Tell this guy to get out of here. This is our man.
There was little news of the war itself. The streets were mostly quiet.
People are stunned by the sudden change, and they're worried and confused and hopeful.
In the Palestinian refugee camps, the radio announced the official government reaction to the ground war. Anger, sorrow, condemnation.
We are still insisting that a ceasefire is something that should be sought, that bloodshed should stop.
Worshippers at Amman's Anglican Church tonight were asked to pray for peace.
Perfect forgiveness.
At a local mosque, this man said he prayed for Iraq's victory. In Yemen today, thousands took to the street to chant for Iraq and Saddam Hussein. Yemen, like Jordan, like Algeria, stands to lose big with the Arab states supporting the Allies. Egypt's President Hosni Mubarak was asked today if Saddam should be removed from power.
I have said this very clearly. I cannot work with him. I never trust this man.
Trust. When the war is over, the Arab states will find themselves looking at one another across a huge rift, the divide between winners and losers of the Gulf War. Garrick?
Thank you, Dennis Murphy in Amman. In the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, although he has supported the UN resolutions, the Soviets have had no role in the war and no success in their diplomatic efforts to prevent it. So all they can do now is watch. In Moscow, Bob Abernathy with the Kremlin reaction.
At the Kremlin, deep disappointment over the ground attack and formal regret that diplomacy had not worked.
The instinct to rely on a military solution prevailed.
After last week's intensive negotiations, today's statement said the differences between what Iraq had accepted and what other countries wanted were not too wide.
The Soviet Union expresses regret that a most realistic chance to secure a peaceful outcome has been passed up.
The official view here is that the U.S.-Soviet alliance is solid, but the personal relationship between Presidents Bush and Gorbachev may have been strained. Bush never told Gorbachev in advance the attack was on. Today, the often hardline Soviet news agency TASS said prospects for a settlement of the crisis have been seriously complicated. It went on, American troops are visibly rubbing their hands in expectation of the chance to crush the Iraqis completely. Gorbachev's support of the anti-Iraq coalition is unpopular with the resurgent right wing here, 100,000 of whom turned out yesterday to honor the Soviet military. Soviet conservatives are uneasy about a major war just across their southern border, where Soviet air defense forces are now on high alert. Gorbachev must also be careful not to offend the 50 million Soviet Muslims to whom Iraqis are already appealing for support.
You announced in the name of Saddam Hussein that the Iraqi troops in Kuwait were ordered to withdraw in compliance with UN Resolution 660, the first of the 12 after the Iraqis invaded Kuwait. Then there was some movement again by the Soviets, which has been going on all day to try to get a UN Security Council meeting going to talk about some new proposal to end the war politically. And in the wake of that, but particularly the Baghdad radio announcement, the president called in his senior advisors. They met for a little more than an hour at the White House this evening. They have now gone home, or at least back to their offices. The president has retired to his private quarters, and the president's press secretary, Marlin Fitzwater, he is on his way down to the White House briefing room to make some kind of an announcement. It may be a response to the Baghdad radio announcement. It may be simply that they've been studying it. We do not know. But just to point out that this is where the evening began, with this announcement on Baghdad radio saying that Iraqi forces were expected to withdraw in compliance with UN Resolution 660. There's also been some sightings on the field of battle of Iraqi troops, some with or without their equipment, we're not sure, actually heading north. The Pentagon says these are sporadic incidents. Nobody knows quite what everything means. Here's Mr. Fitzwater.
We continue to prosecute the war. We have heard no reason to change that. And because there is a war on, our first concern must be the safety and security of the United States and coalition forces. We don't know whether this most recent claim about Iraqi withdrawal is genuine. We have no evidence to suggest the Iraqi army is withdrawing. In fact, Iraqi units are continuing to fight. Moreover, we remember when Saddam Hussein's tanks pretended to surrender at Kafshi, only to turn and fire. We remember the Scud attacks today and Saddam's many broken promises of the past. There are at least an additional 22 dead Americans tonight who offer silent testimony to the intentions of Saddam Hussein. The statement out of Baghdad today says that Saddam Hussein's forces will fight their way out while retreating. We will not attack unarmed soldiers in retreat, but we will consider retreating combat units as a movement of war. The only way Saddam Hussein can persuade the coalition of the seriousness of his intentions would be for him personally and publicly to agree to the terms of the proposal we issued on February 22. And because the announcement from Baghdad referred to the Soviet initiative, he must personally and publicly accept explicitly all relevant UN Security Council resolutions, including especially UN Security Council Resolution 662, which calls for Iraqi rescission of its purported annexation of Kuwait, and UN Security Council Resolution 674, which calls for Iraqi compensation to Kuwait and others. That's the end of the statement. I might just add that the President met with his national security advisors for approximately an hour and 15 minutes this evening to consider this matter, and the President has returned to his residence. Wyatt?
Marlon, any word from Mikhail Gorbachev? Has he called the President and personally asked for a ceasefire?
We've not had any contact with President Gorbachev, although we have had contact with Soviet officials here in their embassy.
The nature of which
Helen?
is what, please? Marlon, the nature of which is what?
To simply inform them of our statement and to discuss the situation as it exists. Helen?
Do you consider the 12 UN resolutions and your February 22 plan as two separate entities that both have to be accepted?
As we explained on Friday, the terms of the February 22 plan, that's the one we disclosed on Friday, was a way of setting criteria for judging the 12 UN resolutions. So it is our judgment that he must still comply with the 12 UN resolutions, and the terms that set forth Friday simply give those details.
Those approved by the UN, the criteria, the terms of this whole...
They are the coalition's terms for describing and explaining the UN Security Council resolutions. Brett?
You have now added the condition that Saddam must do this personally. Why have you added that?
We have added this because of the nature of the Baghdad radio statement today, because of the many broken promises of Saddam Hussein, because he has not responded today concerning this withdrawal either directly to us or to the United Nations, and yet he tries or he purports to be interested in a withdrawal. And our attitude is, if that is the case, we ask him to be upfront publicly and let the whole world know exactly what his intentions are. Pascal?
What do you think Saddam Hussein is trying to do by announcing such a withdrawal?
We have no way of judging his motives. Michael?
As we understand it, the UN Security Council is meeting now or will be meeting shortly, and you're out here rejecting this Baghdad radio offer. What do you know about what they're going to be doing in that meeting that leads you to believe you can come out now and reject it?
We aren't rejecting anything. We don't know that there is a genuine offer. We see no evidence of it on the ground. We have no reason to believe the radio report. What we are saying is we hope it's true. We want him to get out, and this is a way to do it. John?
Marlon, if the Iraq's UN ambassador accepts the resolution calling for withdrawal from Kuwait and announces an Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait, will the U.S. continue to attack?
The ground rules are very clear here. We are not going to attack retreating forces. They should lay down their arms and leave, and they wouldn't have to worry about that. But if they're moving as a combat units, they are still subject to the rules of war. Karen?
Yes. Can you tell us whether there's been any sign of Iraqi troops withdrawing, either with their weapons or without them?
We have no indication that there's any withdrawal taking place. John?
Two things about this withdrawal. It sounds like, one, what you're concerned about is these people possibly taking their weapons back into Iraq and being a threat from Iraq. And two, how do you know these people retreat without their weapons? Some of these people would be in tanks. That's how they travel, right?
The laying down their arms is simply, they simply walk out. The fact is the United States has enormous numbers of troops in that area. The coalition forces are spread throughout the country and throughout Kuwait, and we cannot sacrifice the safety of coalition forces by allowing them to have their weapons and, in effect, to fight their way out, whatever that means.
Literally mean walk. We're talking about armored personnel carriers.
Well, I don't think it needs that definition. I think lay down your arms is pretty clear. Patrick?
How close are we to winning this war so that any UN action might be considered good?
Well, we are making good progress, but we certainly could not predict an end of the war at this time. Final question, Tom.
Is action stalling the UN action, no, Marlon? Trying to see if we can win a decisive victory.
No, the UN, as I understand it, has scheduled an informal meeting for later tonight. We simply want them to know our feelings and a position on this matter as they deliberate this evening.
Well,
Tom?
What do you make of this new Soviet proposal? Did you know it was coming? And is it helpful to the coalition's aims for this to come up at this time?
I'm not aware of a new Soviet proposal.
Well, the Soviets asked the Security Council tonight to look at the proposal.
Well, you mean they proposed a meeting? That's fine, sure.
Do you feel it's helpful at this point for the Soviet Union to continue to press this proposal of theirs?
We think the Soviet Union has been helpful in this process. They have been trying to get a withdrawal. They've been trying to get Saddam Hussein to get out of Kuwait according to the UN resolutions. And in every discussion that President Gorbachev has had with us, he has reasserted his commitment to the UN resolutions. And certainly having the UN review this in any fashion is acceptable with us. That, after all, we are responding to UN resolutions. And tonight's statement would be our position going into those discussions. And this way everyone would know exactly how we feel. Dan, final question.
Is it now the position of the Allies that you all will settle for nothing less than the total humiliation of Saddam Hussein?
No, we'll settle for nothing less than full compliance with the UN resolutions. Thank you very much.
President's Press Secretary Marlon Fitzwater at the White House briefing room. You've heard it as well as we have. The last question may be a crucial one, whether or not President Bush, the Bush administration, wants the personal and public humiliation of Saddam Hussein. The bottom line here, after all that talk about UN resolutions and proposals today and not, is that they're not going to let Saddam Hussein off the hook at the moment. They're not going to facilitate the Soviets trying to bring forward another peace proposal if the Iraqi forces in Kuwait want to leave. In Mr. Fitzwater's words, they can lay down their arms and walk out. That's a key point, of course, because there's been enormous concern in the Bush administration, not to mention among many members of the public who've watched the war so closely, that Saddam Hussein, if he is able to retreat, not be able to retreat with a lot of his expensive equipment. A couple of things here to try to clarify as we go along. First, to the Pentagon, to ABC's Bob Zelnick. Bob, Mr. Fitzwater says they see no evidence today to suggest an Iraqi withdrawal. And yet there are pretty good sources out of the Pentagon today to say that some Iraqis have been going north towards home.
That's correct. There was sporadic movement throughout the day of isolated Iraqi units. As intelligence watched it, they couldn't decide what they were up to. It wasn't until the Baghdad radio broadcast that it appeared that some of the units may have been